Daddy, I'm dirty. That's what a 6-year-old girl whispered into her pillow at 11 o'clock at night in a $40 million penthouse that overlooked half of Manhattan. She didn't say it loud. She wasn't crying for attention. She said it the way you say something you've already decided is true about yourself, quiet, flat, final. And her father heard every word. He was a man who had never lost a negotiation in his life, who had walked out of boardrooms with men twice his age stunned into silence, who could read a balance sheet the way other people read a sentence. And in that one moment, standing in a dark hallway outside his daughter's room, none of it meant anything at all. If you've ever been made to feel small because of where you came from, because of what you didn't have, because of the wrong zip code or the wrong last name, stay with me. This story is going to open something up in you. And when it's done, I want you to tell me in the comments what it opened. Let's begin. Part 1. The Whisper That Shattered Everything. Ethan Mercer had built his entire identity around control. He controlled markets. He controlled boardrooms. He controlled the exact temperature of his penthouse, the exact route his car took to the office, the exact words he allowed himself to feel in any given hour of any given day. What he could not control on that particular night was the sound coming from his daughter's room. He'd come home late, later than usual, his tie already loosened, his mind still running spreadsheets behind his eyes. He meant to walk past Lily's door, the way he did most nights. Just a glance through the crack to confirm she was asleep, and then on to his own room, his own silence, his own bed that had felt too big for 2 years now. But the door wasn't fully closed, and the light from the hallway fell in a thin gold line across the carpet. And he heard her voice. Small. Trembling. Talking to no one, or maybe to the only person she trusted to hear it, herself. I'm dirty. Ethan stopped breathing for a second. He told himself he'd misheard. 6-year-olds said strange things. Maybe she was talking about mud on her shoes, a stain on her dress, something from the playground. But then she said it again, and this time there was a sound underneath it, the sound of a small body trying very hard not to cry and almost succeeding. That's why she doesn't like me. Because I'm dirty. Like Rosa. Ethan pushed the door open. Lily was sitting up in bed, knees pulled to her chest, the blanket bunched in her fists like she was trying to disappear into it. When she saw him, her face did the thing children's faces do when they're caught feeling something they don't yet have words for. A flicker of shame quickly buried. Hey, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. What did you just say? Nothing, Daddy. Lily. She looked at her knees. Veronica said Rosa is dirty. The kind of dirty that doesn't wash off. And today I helped Rosa carry the laundry, and Veronica looked at me like I was dirty too. So I think I am. A little bit. Like her. Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed very slowly, the way you move when you've just realized the floor beneath you isn't as solid as you thought. He had built an empire on data, on knowing things before other people knew them. And in his own home, under his own roof, he had known nothing. To understand how a 6-year-old girl ended up believing she was dirty, you have to go back 2 years to the day a tired, frightened young woman named Rosa first stepped into the marble lobby of Mercer Tower, holding a single suitcase and a folder of references, terrified that none of it would be enough. She had no idea that day that she was walking into a house with 2 very different kinds of poverty in it. Hers which everyone could see and a little girl's which no one could. Part 2. The Man on Top of the World. To the outside world, Ethan Mercer was the kind of success story they put on magazine covers. Self-made, ruthless in negotiations, famous for decisions that other CEOs called reckless and that turned out almost every time to be exactly right 2 years later. He had taken a single robotics patent and built it into a company worth more than the GDP of some small countries. He worked from 5 in the morning until his assistant physically reminded him that dinner existed. He measured his days in decisions: which division to cut, which deal to close, which board member to quietly remove before they became a liability. It was, by every external metric, a perfect life. It was also very privately an empty one. His wife had left 2 years earlier, not for another man, but for a version of freedom that didn't include being married to a spreadsheet. She'd taken almost nothing with her except her own exhaustion, and she had left Lily, then 4 years old, in the only home the child had ever known. Ethan didn't blame her, not really. He understood in the part of himself he never examined too closely, that he had been a husband the way he was a CEO, efficient, generous with money, and absent in every way that actually mattered. After she left, the penthouse filled up with the things money buys instead of presents: a private chef, a driver, a rotation of nannies who never lasted more than a few months, because raising a grieving child in a house run like a corporation is exhausting work, and the pay was never quite enough to offset what the job actually cost a person. And somewhere in all of that order, all of that climate-controlled perfection, there was a ghost. Not a literal one. A presence that had learned very early to make herself small. Rosa moved through that penthouse like a woman trying not to leave fingerprints. She did the laundry, she made Lily's lunches with little notes tucked inside. She learned, without anyone teaching her, exactly which hallway tiles creaked and how to avoid them so she wouldn't disturb Mr. Mercer's calls. She existed in the in-between spaces of that home, present in every meal Lily ate, every outfit Lily wore, every bedtime story Lily fell asleep to, and almost entirely invisible to the man who paid her salary. Ethan saw her the way you see furniture you've grown used to. A fixture. Reliable. Replaceable if it came to that, though it never occurred to him how much would actually be lost if it did. He didn't know that Rosa had a younger sister back home raising Rosa's own son so that Rosa could send money every 2 weeks without fail. He didn't know she'd once been a nursing student, 2 semesters from a degree, before her life took a sharp turn that this story will return to. He didn't know that every night, after Lily was asleep, Rosa sat at the small kitchen table off the staff hallway with a second-hand textbook on child nutrition, highlighting passages by lamplight, because she'd promised herself she would not stay where she was forever. He didn't know any of it, because he had never once asked. There was a particular kind of poverty that lived inside Mercer Tower, and it wasn't the kind anyone could see from the street. It was the poverty of attention. Ethan could authorize a 7-figure donation to a children's hospital wing with a single signature, and feel for a moment like a generous man. But he could not remember, most weeks, what grade Lily was in without checking with the household calendar his assistant maintained. He had confused the appearance of providing for the substance of it, and the two had drifted so far apart that he no longer noticed the gap. Rosa noticed it constantly. She noticed it in the way Lily's eyes would flick toward the elevator every evening around 6, hoping, and the small practiced way she'd swallow the disappointment when the doors didn't open until well past 9. She noticed it in the birthday parties Ethan funded lavishly and attended for exactly 40 minutes before an urgent call pulled him away. She never said anything about it. It wasn't her place, she told herself, and besides, she needed the job too badly to risk being seen as anything other than easy, agreeable, invisible. That invisibility had a cost she rarely let herself examine directly. Some nights, after Lily was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet except for the hum of the city 40 floors below, Rosa would sit in the small room off the kitchen that had been assigned to her. Clean, comfortable, entirely separate from the rest of the home in a way that felt less like privacy and more like a boundary someone had drawn around her. And she would think about her own son, asleep in a different city, growing up mostly through video calls and the careful, curated updates her sister sent her. She had traded one child's daily presence for another child's daily care. And the math of that trade never stopped aching, even when she'd made peace with the necessity of it. She told herself on the hardest nights that it was temporary, that the textbook on the kitchen table was a promise to herself she intended to keep, one highlighted page at a time, even if it took years longer than she'd once planned. She told herself that dignity didn't require anyone else's permission. She believed it mostly. But belief and loneliness are not mutually exclusive, and Rosa carried both of them quietly every single day, in a home full of more square footage than she had ever stood inside of in her life, and somehow less warmth than the cramped one-bedroom apartment she'd grown up in. And into that silence, into that vacuum where a father's attention should have lived, walked a woman who was about to make everything worse before, eventually, making it better. Part 3: The Poison and Pearls. Veronica Sterling looked in every photograph like exactly what she was supposed to be. The next Mrs. Mercer. Old money, new face. A smile that had been practiced in front of enough cameras to look effortless. She had met Ethan at a charity gala 8 months earlier, and within weeks she had slotted herself into his life with the precision of someone executing a long-term plan. She was, by any objective measure, beautiful, elegant, charming when charm served her. She was also, underneath all of it, cruel in a way that left no fingerprints. Veronica had grown up being told, explicitly and implicitly, that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who belonged at the table and those who served the table. It wasn't a belief she examined. It was simply the air she'd breathed since birth. And when she looked at Rosa, at her second-hand cardigans, her careful economical movements, the quiet dignity she carried like something she'd built herself out of necessity, Veronica didn't see a person working hard to survive. She saw a reminder of a world she'd been taught to find distasteful. Started small, the way these things always do. A comment here. Correction there. Rosa dear, we don't fold towels that way in this household. Said with a smile in front of Ethan, so that it sounded like helpfulness instead of humiliation. A request for Rosa to eat her own meals in the staff kitchen rather than at the family table, even on the nights Ethan worked late and it was only Lily and Rosa and an empty dining room that could have held the warmth of two people eating together. None of it was loud enough for Ethan to notice. That was the design of it. Cruelty disguised as standards. Contempt disguised as taste. But children notice. Children always notice. Lily had started to ask Rosa quiet questions in the months Veronica had been a fixture in their lives. Why does Veronica wash her hands after she touches your sweater? Why did she say your apartment sounds cute in that weird voice? Why doesn't she ever look at you when she talks to you? Rosa had no good answer for a 6-year-old. She gave the only one she had. Some people think being kind costs them something, Mija. Doesn't. But they think it does. What Rosa couldn't explain, what she barely let herself think about, was the cumulative weight of it. The way Veronica's small daily contempt had started to feel less like an insult aimed at Rosa, and more like a verdict on an entire category of person Rosa belonged to. A category Veronica had quietly, casually, begun applying to Lily too, whenever the girl got too close to the help. There had been other moments, smaller ones, that no single adult had ever stacked together to see the pattern. There was the afternoon Veronica found a thrift store sweater Rosa had given Lily as a small gift, soft, a little faded, chosen with care because Rosa knew exactly how much a 6-year-old loved butterflies, and suggested in front of Lily that they donate it back to wherever it came from, before anyone important saw her wearing it. There was the time Veronica corrected Lily's table manners by holding up Rosa as the example of what not to become. We don't eat like that. That's how people who didn't have proper upbringings eat. There was the birthday card Rosa had helped Lily make for Ethan, hand-drawn and a little crooked at the edges, that Veronica had quietly thrown away and replaced with a store-bought one, telling Lily her father would prefer something that actually looked nice. Each incident alone could be explained away. Together, they formed something far more deliberate. A slow, patient campaign to teach a 6-year-old exactly where the lines of class were drawn, and which side of them she was supposed to protect at all costs, even if it meant distancing herself from the only consistent maternal warmth she had left in her life. Rosa absorbed most of it silently, the way people who need their jobs learn to absorb things. But she watched Lily absorb it too, and that was the part she couldn't make peace with no matter how many times she told herself it wasn't her place to intervene. She started, in small ways, trying to counteract it, reminding Lily quietly that kindness wasn't about which store something came from, that her drawing had been beautiful exactly as it was, that a person's worth was never something you could read off a price tag. But she was one voice in a house where the other voice had money, status, and an engagement ring behind it, and she knew, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent a lifetime being underestimated, that it might not be enough. What made it harder was that Veronica was never cruel in front of Ethan in any way he could have caught and named easily. She saved her real self for the hours he wasn't home, which were most of them, and around him she performed a different woman entirely, warm, gracious, the kind of fiancée who complimented Rosa's cooking at dinner parties and asked after her family with practiced concern. It was a performance so polished that even Rosa, who lived inside the contradiction every day, sometimes found herself second-guessing what she'd witnessed, wondering if she was the one being unfair, the one reading too much into a tone, a glance, a pause that lasted half a second too long. That particular kind of doubt, the doubt cruelty plants in the person it targets, making them question their own perception of the harm being done to them, was in its own way one of the most damaging parts of the whole arrangement. It came to a head on an ordinary Tuesday. Lily had been helping Rosa fold laundry in the utility room, something they did together most weeks, a small ritual of warm towels and silly songs that was, without either of them realizing it, one of the only times in Lily's entire week that felt like being mothered. Veronica found them there. Lily had a smudge of detergent powder on her cheek and was laughing at something Rosa had said. Veronica's face did something quick and ugly before it smoothed back into its public expression. "Lily, sweetheart, go wash up. You look filthy." A pause, her eyes flicking to Rosa. "It rubs off, you know. That kind of dirty. If you spend enough time around it." She said it lightly, almost playfully. The kind of comment designed to be deniable if anyone ever repeated it back to her. But Lily heard the real sentence underneath the words. And so did Rosa, who stood very still, a warm towel still folded in her hands, and said nothing because she had learned the hard way exactly what happened to women like her when they said something back to women like Veronica. That night was the night Lily whispered 2 words into her pillow that her father was never supposed to hear. Part 4. 2 words, one world collapsing. Let's go back to that bedroom. To Ethan, sitting frozen on the edge of his daughter's bed, hearing the word dirty land in his chest like something physical. "Lily, look at me." He waited until she did. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't let herself cry, not all the way. Another thing he didn't know about her, that she'd already learned to swallow tears before they fell, because somewhere along the way she'd absorbed the idea that her feelings were inconvenient. "You are not dirty," he said. "Do you understand me? Not even a little bit." But Veronica said. I don't care what Veronica said. The words came out harder than he meant, and he saw Lily flinch, and he hated himself for it, and he softened his voice with effort. "I care what's true. And what's true is that you are the best thing in this entire building, in this entire city, and nothing about you is dirty." Not your hands, not your heart. None of it. Is Rosa dirty? The question hit him sideways. No, he said, and he meant it instinctively before he'd even thought it through. Rosa works hard. That's not the same thing as dirty. Why would you think that? And then it came pouring out of her. The towel comment, the hand washing, the we don't fold things that way. The staff kitchen meals, the months of small cruelties a child had been quietly cataloging while the adults around her assumed she was too young to notice anything. Ethan listened to his daughter describe, in the broken, half-formed language of a 6-year-old, a pattern of contempt he had been completely blind to. And underneath the shock, something far worse was rising in him. The question of how. How had this happened under his roof 3 feet from the rooms he slept in, and he had not seen 1 second of it? He thought about every dinner Veronica had attended where Rosa wasn't at the table. He'd assumed it was Rosa's preference, her professionalism, her wanting to give the family privacy. He had never once asked her directly. He had never once noticed that professional distance, and being made to feel unwelcome in your own workplace, can look identical from the outside, if you're not paying attention. He thought about the word filthy applied to his daughter's cheek, smudged with nothing more sinister than laundry powder, and how a woman who was about to become his wife had used that smudge as a weapon against a 6-year-old, casually, almost without thinking, because that was simply how she thought. He thought about every fine and good Lily had given him over dinner the past few months, every time he'd asked, distracted, how her day had been, and never once heard what was actually underneath those one-word answers. For a man who built his fortune on seeing what other people missed, it was a brutal kind of irony. He had missed the only thing that had ever actually mattered. Lily, he said quietly, I need you to tell me the truth about something, and I promise you won't get in trouble. Has Veronica ever said anything like that to you before? About being dirty, or not as good as other people? Lily nodded slowly. She said poor people smell different. She said it's not their fault, it's just true. She said I shouldn't tell you because you'd get upset and it's not a big deal. There it was. Not just the cruelty, but the architecture built to protect the cruelty. The instruction to a 6-year-old to keep her father from finding out, dressed up as kindness, as not wanting to upset him. Ethan sat with his daughter until she fell asleep, her hand eventually loosening its grip on his sleeve, her breathing slowing into something even and unguarded. He stayed long after that, in the dark, replaying 2 years of his own absence. He thought, with a kind of nausea he wasn't used to feeling, about how often he had told himself that providing was the same as parenting, that the private school tuition, the summer camps, the closet full of clothes Lily would outgrow before she ever wore half of them, that all of it amounted to love as long as the checks cleared on time. He had built his entire sense of fatherhood on the assumption that as long as Lily had everything, she would feel like she had everything. It had never once occurred to him that a child could be surrounded by abundance and still feel, in the only ways that actually mattered to her, deeply and quietly poor. He thought about the word dirty, again turning it over, and realized it wasn't really about cleanliness at all. It was about belonging. Veronica hadn't been teaching his daughter about hygiene. She'd been teaching her where the boundaries of acceptable company were drawn, and which side of those boundaries determined whether you were loved without conditions or merely tolerated until you proved inconvenient. Lily had absorbed the lesson perfectly, the way children absorb everything adults assume goes over their heads. She hadn't misunderstood Veronica at all. She had understood her exactly. Tell me something. And I want you to actually answer this in the comments, not just keep scrolling. Has there ever been a moment where you realized you've been so focused on providing for someone that you completely missed what they actually needed? Drop a comment. I read every one of them, and I think this part of the story is going to hit a lot of you harder than you expect. Because Ethan's next move wasn't to confront Veronica immediately, in a blaze of righteous anger, the way a movie might write it. His next move was quieter, and in its own way more damning. He decided to actually look at the two women in his house he had never bothered to truly see. Part 5: What he never saw. The next morning, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan didn't leave for the office at 6. He told his assistant to push his first 3 meetings, ignored the look of mild panic that caused, and instead sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he didn't drink, watching his own household the way he'd watch a company he was considering acquiring, except this time, he was looking for what he'd missed, not what he could extract. He watched Rosa make Lily's lunch. She didn't just throw food into a container. She arranged it, a small note tucked under the napkin that he recognized, with a jolt, as the same kind of note she'd been writing every single day for 2 years. He'd seen those notes in Lily's lunchbox before, dismissed them as a sweet little quirk of the nanny, never once asked to read one. He picked one up from the counter, where Rosa had left an extra she'd messed up writing. It read, "You are brave even on the days that feel hard. I'm proud of you. He thought about every report card, every school project, every small accomplishment of his daughter's that he'd acknowledged with a distracted "great job, sweetheart" on his way out the door. This woman, who he paid less in a year than he spent on a single watch, had been doing the actual work of raising his child while he funded the address it happened in. He started paying attention to Rosa herself, not just what she did for Lily. He noticed the textbook on the kitchen table one evening, Foundations of Pediatric Nutrition, dog-eared, heavily highlighted, with handwritten notes crowding the margins. He asked her about it, the first real question he'd asked her in 2 years that wasn't logistical. Rosa looked startled that he'd noticed, then cautious, the way people are cautious when attention from someone powerful has historically meant something was about to go wrong. "I was a nursing student," she said carefully. "Before. I had 1 more year left." "What happened?" She hesitated, and he watched her decide in real time how much truth she could afford to give him. "My mother got sick. I had a son to take care of and no one else to help. I had to choose between paying rent and finishing school."
I chose rent.
A pause. "I still study when I can. I haven't given up on it. I just had to put it down for a while." Ethan sat with that. A woman who had been forced by circumstances entirely outside her control to set aside an entire future, and who had spent 2 years quietly, privately, refusing to let that future die completely, studying by lamplight after raising someone else's child all day, while the man paying her salary had never once asked her name's full story. He thought about his own path. The elite university. The seed money from his own father, an executive himself, that had let Ethan take risks most people never get to take, because failure for him would have meant disappointment, not eviction. He had spent years telling interviewers his success was the product of hard work and vision, and it was, but it had also been built on a foundation Rosa had never been given the chance to stand on. The same hours of effort in 2 different lives had produced 2 wildly different outcomes, and the difference wasn't talent. It was the ground each of them had started on. He began noticing other things too. The way Rosa budgeted her own grocery list with a precision that bordered on art, stretching every dollar of her modest salary because half of it went home to her family. The patience she showed Lily on the hardest days, the tantrums, the grief that still surfaced sometimes for the mother who'd left, the slow work of helping a child feel safe again. The dignity she carried into a household that had, in countless small ways, told her she didn't deserve a seat at its table. He thought of Veronica, who had been born with every advantage Rosa had been denied, and who had used that advantage not to lift others, but to remind them daily exactly how far beneath her they stood. The contrast was no longer abstract to him. It had a face. Two faces, actually, one his fiancée's, one his housekeeper's, and for the first time he understood with total clarity which one belonged in his life, and which one had been there by mistake. He started staying later in the kitchen in the mornings not to monitor anything, but because he found himself genuinely wanting to be near the version of his household that actually worked. He watched Rosa handle a scraped knee with calm, practiced hands before Lily had even finished registering it hurt. He watched her redirect a tantrum about a missing toy into a quiet conversation about feelings, using words a child psychologist would have approved of, words she'd clearly learned not from any parenting manual handed to her by the household but from sheer determined trial and error late nights, and the textbook she kept hidden under a stack of dish towels because some instinct told her it wasn't her place to look like she had ambitions beyond the job description. He thought about the cost of that hiding. How many people in this building, in this city, were quietly burying their own potential under the assumption that wanting more for themselves would be read as ingratitude, or arrogance, or stepping out of line. He had spent his entire career rewarding ambition in people who looked like him, who'd come from where he'd come from, and had never once stopped to wonder how much talent simply went unnoticed because it didn't come dressed the way he expected ambition to dress. One evening, he found Rosa rewriting a budget on a scrap of paper at the kitchen table, calculating with visible care exactly how to split her paycheck between rent, her sister, her son's school supplies, and a single weekly allowance for herself that was barely enough for a cup of coffee on the way to class. She didn't know he was watching. He stood in the doorway longer than he should have, struck by the quiet, unglamorous heroism of it. A woman doing more with less than he had ever once had to consider, simply because the world had never given her the option not to. It made him think uncomfortably about the language he and his peers used at conferences and shareholder meetings, words like grit and resilience, thrown around as compliments for people who had simply survived circumstances no one should have had to survive in the first place. He had spent years admiring scrappy founders who'd bootstrapped companies from a garage, never once extending that same admiration to a woman bootstrapping an entire family from a kitchen table with a highlighter and a part-time class schedule. The double standard sat heavy in his chest. Grit was apparently only inspiring when it eventually produced a billion-dollar exit. When it simply produced a stable, loving home for 2 children on a modest paycheck, no one wrote articles about it. No one invited it to speak on a panel. He started slowly to ask Rosa for her opinion on things that had nothing to do with Lily's schedule, what she thought of a school he was considering, what she'd want if she were starting over today, whether she still believed she'd finish that nursing degree someday. Her answers, when she finally trusted that the questions weren't a trap or a test, were sharper and more considered than half the answers he got from people with far more letters after their names. He had simply never bothered to ask before, because he had decided, without ever examining the decision, that her insight stopped at the edge of her job description. Part 6. When money can't buy decency. Ethan didn't ambush Veronica. That wasn't his style, even now, even furious. He scheduled the conversation the way he scheduled everything, deliberately, in a setting where she couldn't perform for an audience, where the only people in the room would be the two of them and the truth. He sat her down in his study that evening and told her plainly what Lily had said. The whisper, the towel, the dirty, the instruction to keep it secret. He watched Veronica's face for the thing he'd seen 100 times in negotiations. The moment someone realizes they've been caught, and the calculation that follows about which version of denial might still work. She's 6, Ethan. Children exaggerate. I never said anything like that to her directly. You said it about Rosa. In front of her. More than once, apparently. Rosa is the housekeeper. There's a way things are done in households like this one, and I was simply maintaining. Maintaining what exactly? His voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. Standards? Or contempt? Because from where I'm sitting, those are the same thing in your mouth. Veronica's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. You're upset because of something a 6-year-old misunderstood. I have never once been anything but professional with that woman. She told my daughter that poor people smell different. That it's not their fault, it's just true. Lily repeated that to me word for word last night, Veronica. Word for word. Children don't invent specific, ugly little theories like that. They repeat what they hear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the study window, the city glittered the way it always did, indifferent to what was happening 40 floors above its streets. Do you understand what you actually did? Ethan asked, quieter now. You didn't just insult a grown woman who can't easily push back against you. You convinced a 6-year-old that she had to choose between loving the person who actually raises her every day and being acceptable to the person who was about to become her stepmother. You made her ration her own affection because you taught her affection for the wrong person was dangerous. Veronica's jaw tightened. I never told her to stop loving anyone. You told her dirty rubs off if you spend enough time around it. To a 6-year-old, that's the same thing. So what is this? Veronica said finally, her voice losing its smoothness, edges of real anger showing through. An interrogation? Because of the help. Because of my daughter. Rosa is a separate conversation and frankly an even worse one for you. But let's stay on Lily for now. You made my 6-year-old believe she was dirty because she helped fold laundry. You made her afraid to tell me, because you knew exactly how this would look if I found out. I was teaching her about boundaries, about class, things she needs to understand if she's going to survive in the world we live in. And there it was, the real Veronica, finally unguarded, saying out loud the belief she'd spent 8 months disguising as taste and manners. A worldview where some people simply existed beneath others, and where teaching a 6-year-old to internalize that hierarchy was framed as preparation rather than poison. Ethan felt something settle in him with total clarity. Not rage anymore, something colder and more final than rage. You know what's strange, he said. I built a company by finding the thing everyone else missed. The pattern under the noise. And I missed this. I missed it because I let myself believe that someone who looked perfect on paper, who came from the right background, who said all the right things at galas, must actually be decent underneath it. I confused polish for character. That's my mistake, and I'm going to own it. Ethan. But here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to let my daughter grow up believing that the size of someone's bank account determines whether they deserve dignity. I'm not going to keep someone in this house who teaches her that. And I'm not going to marry someone who thinks cruelty is just maintaining standards. Veronica's mask, the one she'd worn so well for 8 months, finally fell away entirely, and what was underneath it wasn't grief over losing him. It was fury at being exposed, at having the curtain pulled back on a worldview she'd never expected to have to defend out loud, to his face, with no audience to perform for. You'll regret this, she said. Women like Rosa don't end up mattering, Ethan. In 5 years you won't even remember her name. That's exactly the kind of thing, Ethan said, standing, ending the conversation the way he ended every negotiation he had already won. That tells me I'm making the right decision. Before she left the study, Veronica tried one more angle, the way people raised to always win an argument often do. Not an apology but a reframing. You're being naive, she said. You think because you write a few checks for scholarships now, you're suddenly one of the good ones? You'll get tired of this performance in 6 months. People like us don't actually change, Ethan. We just feel guilty for a while and then go back to normal. It was, in its own twisted way, the most honest thing she'd said all night. An admission that her cruelty wasn't an aberration but a worldview she expected everyone of her class to eventually return to, because she'd never seen anyone actually choose differently and stay that way. Ethan didn't argue with her. He simply let the silence answer for him, the kind of silence that told her, more clearly than any retort could have, that he intended to prove her wrong. She left within the week. The penthouse, for the first time in 8 months, exhaled. Part 7. The silence after the storm. The first few days after Veronica moved her things out were strange in a way Ethan hadn't anticipated. The penthouse didn't feel emptier. It felt, for the first time in a long while, like it had room in it for something honest. He started coming home earlier. Not every day, not perfectly, not in some instant transformation that erased 2 years of absence, but consistently enough that it became a pattern Lily started to notice and cautiously to trust. The first family dinner the three of them shared, Ethan, Lily, and Rosa, all at the same table, no staff kitchen, no separation, was almost comically awkward. Ethan didn't know how to make small talk with a 6-year-old about her day, without it sounding like a board meeting agenda. Rosa kept glancing at him like she expected to be told at any moment that this had been a mistake, that she should go eat somewhere else. Lily, oblivious to the adult tension, simply narrated her entire day in exhausting detail, delighted to have an audience of 2 instead of 0. "You don't have to eat in here separately anymore," Ethan said to Rosa eventually, when Lily had run off to get a drawing she wanted to show them. "I should have said that a long time ago. I'm sorry it took this to get me to say it." Rosa looked at him for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to trust the offer. "Thank you," she said simply. It wasn't gushing or dramatic. It was the response of someone who had learned not to expect much, being handed slightly more than expected, and choosing to accept it without making it bigger than it was. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the rhythm of the household that was hard to name but impossible to miss. Ethan started asking Rosa actual questions about her son, about the nursing program she'd had to leave, about what she actually wanted for her own life, separate from what the job required of her. He found himself, more than once, genuinely curious about her answers in a way that had nothing to do with managing his household and everything to do with simply wanting to know her. He didn't fall into anything dramatic or sudden. This wasn't a story about a billionaire sweeping in to rescue someone. It was slower than that and more honest. It was a man finally doing the basic unglamorous work of paying attention to the people in his own home, work he should have been doing for years, and was only now learning, somewhat clumsily, how to do. For Lily, the change was simpler to describe, if not to fully understand. Her house got quieter in the way that meant safer, instead of quieter in the way that meant lonely. She stopped flinching when she dropped things. She stopped preemptively apologizing for taking up space. She started slowly telling her father things without being asked twice. One night, weeks later, she crawled into Ethan's lap while he was reading and asked, out of nowhere, "Daddy, am I still dirty?" He set down whatever he was holding. "No, baby. You were never dirty. Not for one single second. The person who told you that was wrong about you, and honestly, she was wrong about a lot of people. Is Rosa not dirty either?" "Rosa," Ethan said, "works harder than almost anyone I have ever met, and she has more dignity in one finger than some people have in their entire bodies. Dirty was never the right word for either of you. It was never even close." Lily seemed to file this away with the simple, total acceptance children give to things their parents say with enough certainty. And in that small exchange, Something that had cracked 2 years' worth of damage finally, quietly began to mend. There was another moment weeks after that one that Ethan never told anyone about, not even Rosa. He'd come home to find Lily had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for him, a half-finished drawing of our family still in her hand. He sat down beside her, careful not to wake her, and looked at the drawing for a long time. 3 stick figures all smiling, none of them labeled dirty or less than or anything but exactly what they were. He thought about how close he had come to never seeing this version of his daughter at all. How easily 2 more years of distracted distance could have hardened that quiet whisper into something permanent. It was, he realized, the closest he had ever come to understanding what people meant when they talked about a second chance. Part 8. From the Mud to the Sky. A year later, the household looked nothing like it had before. Not because the apartment had changed, but because the people in it had. Rosa had gone back to school. Ethan had offered at first simply to pay her tuition outright, the way he solved most problems: write a check, remove the obstacle. Rosa had turned that down, gently but firmly. "I don't want it handed to me," she told him. "I want a loan I can pay back. I want to know it's mine when I'm done." What she accepted instead was something smaller and in its own way more meaningful. A flexible schedule that let her attend evening classes, and a quiet promise from Ethan that her job would be there waiting, exactly as it was, whether she needed it for 2 more years or 10. She finished her degree 18 months later. Ethan, Lily, and Rosa's own son sat together at the small graduation ceremony, an unlikely trio cheering louder than anyone else in the room when her name was called. It was, by every account, one of the proudest days of Rosa's life, and watching her walk across that stage, something settled permanently in Ethan that he didn't bother trying to name out loud, not yet. Lily, now 7, had become a different kind of child than the one who'd whispered, "I'm dirty," into a pillow. She still helped fold laundry sometimes, not because anyone made her, but because it had become one of her favorite ways to spend time with Rosa, and there was no longer any shadow hanging over the act. She'd started on her own, correcting other kids at school when they said something dismissive about a classmate's house, or clothes, or family situation, small, fierce defenses delivered in a 7-year-old's voice, but rooted in something that had been planted in her, painfully, and had grown into something good. Ethan changed too, in ways that surprised people who'd known him for years. He restructured part of his company's hiring practices after realizing how many talented people like Rosa, had been filtered out of opportunities not for lack of ability but for lack of the right background, the right connections, the right zip code on a resume. He started a scholarship fund, quietly, without press releases, for working parents trying to finish degrees they'd had to abandon. He never called it redemption. He just called it overdue. It wasn't always smooth. There were nights Ethan slipped back into old habits, came home late without calling, missed a school play he'd promised to attend because a deal needed closing. The difference now was what happened afterward. He actually apologized, not with a gift to smooth it over but with words, and then he showed up fully the next time and the time after that, until the apologies became less necessary because the showing up became the default instead of the exception. Lily learned slowly that one missed evening didn't mean she'd been forgotten again. That lesson took longer to land than any of the others, because trust, once cracked, rebuilds at its own pace regardless of how badly the adults around it want to rush the process. None of it erased what had happened. None of it undid 2 years of a child believing, even briefly, that she was somehow less than because of who she spent her afternoons with. But it built something real on top of the damage, a family stitched together not by blood alone, but by the slow, deliberate choice to actually see each other every single day, instead of moving past each other in the same hallways for years without ever truly looking. There was a moment near the end of that year that Ethan would later describe as the one that made everything else feel worth it. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that wouldn't make it into any account of his life as a businessman. Lily had a school assignment to draw the people in my family, and she came home with a single sheet of paper covered in crayon. Herself in the middle, Ethan on one side, Rosa on the other, all three holding hands, with a small dog they didn't even own drawn happily at their feet because, as she explained very seriously, "We're getting one eventually, I already decided." Ethan kept that drawing in his office in a frame on the wall opposite his desk, where every board member, every investor, every person who walked in expecting to see the trophies of his success instead found a crayon drawing of a family that had been rebuilt out of attention, apology, and the simple decision to keep showing up. Rosa, for her part, never let the changed circumstances make her forget where she'd started. She kept the highlighted nutrition textbook on a shelf in her new larger room. Not as a trophy but as a reminder. She still wrote a note for Lily's lunch every single day, even after there was no longer any practical reason she had to. Some habits she'd learned weren't about necessity. They were about love that had decided, a long time ago, to show up in writing, even on the days no one was watching to notice. What had once been the loneliest penthouse in the building had become, against every odd, the warmest one. Part 9. The question I need you to answer. So here's where the story lands. A little girl whispered 2 words into her pillow, thinking no one was listening, and those 2 words exposed a truth her father had been too busy, too comfortable, too distracted to see for 2 entire years. That you can build an empire and still completely fail the people standing closest to you, if you never bother to actually look at them. Veronica wasn't a villain because she was rich. She was a villain because she used what she had, beauty, money, status, as a weapon against people who had less of it, and because she taught a child, casually, cruelly, that human worth could be measured in zip codes and bank balances. Rosa wasn't a hero because she was poor. She was a hero because, with almost nothing handed to her, she chose dignity, patience, and quiet effort every single day, when no one was watching and no one was rewarding her for it. And Ethan was the one most of us should recognize ourselves in, if we're honest. Not cruel. Not a villain. Just absent. Just so wrapped up in providing that he forgot to actually be present. So convinced that money solved problems that he never noticed the problems money can't touch. The hardest part of this story isn't Veronica's cruelty. Cruelty like hers is easy to spot once it's named out loud, easy to condemn from a safe distance. The harder part is Ethan's blindness, because most of us have been a version of him at some point, not malicious, just distracted, just so focused on the next deadline, the next obligation, the next thing that felt urgent, that we missed the quiet voice in the next room trying to tell us something important. The whisper in this story didn't happen because Ethan was a bad father. It happened because being a present father takes more than money, more than good intentions, more than loving someone in the abstract. Takes actually stopping, actually listening, actually asking the follow-up question instead of accepting the easy answer. Here's my question for you, and I genuinely want you to answer it in the comments, not scroll past it. Have you ever judged someone, even quietly, even privately, even just for a second, based on what they had instead of who they were? And on the other side of that, has anyone ever made you feel less than because of where you came from, what you wore, what neighborhood you grew up in? I want to hear both versions of that story. The times you got it wrong and the times it happened to you. Because the only way stories like Lily's stop happening to real kids in real homes is if enough of us are honest enough to recognize the small, quiet ways we've all participated in this, on one side of it or the other. Maybe you were the kid who got the look when you wore the same shoes 2 years in a row. Maybe you were the parent too buried in work to notice your own child going quiet. Maybe, if you're being completely honest with yourself, you were Veronica for 30 seconds once in a moment you've never told anyone about, and you've been carrying the shame of it ever since. Whoever you were in that story, say it below. This is the part of the comment section where the real story actually happens, the one that doesn't end when the video does. Drop your story below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if this one hit you the way I think it's going to hit a lot of you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because somewhere out there right now there's a kid whispering something into a pillow that an adult needs to actually stop and listen to. I'll see you in the comments. This part of this story isn't Veronica's cruelty. Cruelty like hers is easy to spot once it's named out loud, easy to condemn from a safe distance. The harder part is Ethan's blindness, because most of us have been a version of him at some point, not malicious, just distracted, just so focused on the next deadline, the next obligation, the next thing that felt urgent, that we missed the quiet voice in the next room trying to tell us something important. The whisper in this story didn't happen because Ethan was a bad father. It happened because being a present father takes more than money, more than good intentions, more than loving someone in the abstract. Takes actually stopping, actually listening, actually asking the follow-up question instead of accepting the easy answer. Here's my question for you, and I genuinely want you to answer it in the comments, not scroll past it. Have you ever judged someone, even quietly, even privately, even just for a second, based on what they had instead of who they were? And on the other side of that, has anyone ever made you feel less than because of where you came from, what you wore, what neighborhood you grew up in? I want to hear both versions of that story. The times you got it wrong and the times it happened to you. Because the only way stories like Lily's stop happening to real kids in real homes is if enough of us are honest enough to recognize the small, quiet ways we've all participated in this, on one side of it or the other. Maybe you were the kid who got the look when you wore the same shoes 2 years in a row. Maybe you were the parent too buried in work to notice your own child going quiet. Maybe, if you're being completely honest with yourself, you were Veronica for 30 seconds once in a moment you've never told anyone about, and you've been carrying the shame of it ever since. Whoever you were in that story, say it below. This is the part of the comment section where the real story actually happens, the one that doesn't end when the video does. Drop your story below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if this one hit you the way I think it's going to hit a lot of you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because somewhere out there right now there's a kid whispering something into a pillow that an adult needs to actually stop and listen to. I'll see you in the comments.